There are words born from the deepest silence, words that carry the weight of an entire lifetime. And sometimes those words only find their voice when time is running out, when there's nothing left to lose, nothing left to prove, just the truth, raw, naked, and liberating. He sat there, in a worn wooden chair, fingers trembling over a yellowed sheet of paper. The pen hesitated. His tired eyes looked at something far beyond that room, perhaps at the past, perhaps at a future he wouldn't see. But his hands knew what they needed to write, because those words weren't just his. They belonged to everyone who ever had to choose between hatred and peace. He forgave the person who destroyed his family. Yes, you read that right. Forgave. Not because it was easy, not because it was fair, but because carrying that weight was killing what was left of him. And in the final hours of his life, he found something many search for their entire lives and never find: peace. A strange peace, uncomfortable, almost impossible to explain, but real. This is the story of a man who lost everything, who watched his family shatter before his eyes, who felt rage burn through his insides like fire, and who, even so, chose the hardest path, the path of forgiveness. But listen carefully. This isn't a story about naive goodness, nor about forgetting what happened. It's about surviving your own pain, and about the last words he left behind. Because in the end, when everything fades away, what remains? What really matters? He discovered the answer, and you need to hear what he had to say, because maybe, just maybe, these words are also meant for you. His name was Daniel Ferreira. An ordinary man, the kind you'd pass on the street without noticing. Average height, graying hair starting to dominate his temples, calloused hands from a lifetime of work. He wasn't special in the world's eyes. He had no fortune, no fame, no extraordinary stories to tell. He was just a father, a husband, a man who woke up early, drank black coffee without sugar, and headed to work with the same routine as always. For 30 years, Daniel worked as a carpenter. His hands created furniture that entered other families' homes. Cribs for babies he'd never meet. Tables where meals would be shared. Shelves that would hold memories. He liked that. He liked the idea that his work somehow became part of people's lives. It was his silent way of mattering, of existing beyond himself. But what Daniel truly loved was at home. His wife, Helena, was the center of everything. They met young, at a 4th of July barbecue where she wore a yellow dress that seemed to capture all the light in the world. He was never good with romantic words, but that night he managed to say something that made her smile. And that smile changed everything. They married 6 months later, had 2 children, Lucas and Sophia. And for 23 years, they built a simple life, but one filled with meaning. Daniel was a man of few words but constant gestures. He'd fix his son's bike without being asked, would leave coffee ready for Helena before heading out, saved his daughter's favorite desserts at the back of the fridge, hidden, so she'd find them as a surprise. They were small things, invisible, but they were the language he knew. The way he said, "I love you," without ever needing to speak the words. He had his dreams, of course. He dreamed of traveling with Helena when he retired. Seeing the coast, maybe. Seeing the ocean for real, not just in photos. He dreamed of seeing Sophia graduate, Lucas building his own family. He wanted to be a grandfather. He wanted time. He wanted to grow old beside the woman he loved, laughing at the same jokes, remembering the same stories until one of them departed and the other remained guarding the memory of what was. But Daniel didn't know his dreams had an expiration date, that the time he imagined having ahead was an illusion as fragile as glass, because something was happening, something he hadn't yet noticed. Small signs, almost imperceptible. Helena coming home late. Conversations interrupted when he entered the room. Gazes that no longer met. He attributed everything to fatigue, to stress, to routine. But the truth was there, waiting for the right moment to explode. And when it exploded, nothing would be the same. Daniel Ferreira was just an ordinary man, but his story is far from ordinary. Because what he lived through, what he lost, and what he chose to do afterward will touch something inside you, something you might not even know exists, something that hurts and that heals. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday in March. Daniel remembers because it was Sophia's birthday, and he'd left the workshop early to pick up the cake he'd ordered. When he got home, the living room was empty. He called for Helena. Nothing. He climbed the stairs, checked the bedroom. Nothing. Then he saw her cell phone on the kitchen table, vibrating. One message. Then another. And another. He'd never been the type of man who searches through phones. Never had reason to. But something in that moment made him stop. Something in the way the messages kept arriving, insistent, urgent. He picked up the device, unlocked it, and read. 3 words were enough for the ground to disappear beneath his feet. I love you. Signed by a name he knew all too well. Rodrigo, his best friend, Lucas's godfather, the man he considered a brother. Daniel sat down slowly. The phone slipped from his hands and fell onto the table with a hollow sound. He couldn't breathe right, couldn't think. The messages kept appearing on the lit screen, each one piercing a little deeper. Meeting plans, intimate words, promises, lies disguised as love. And the worst part? This wasn't new. It wasn't a one-day mistake. It was a story, a long story, built behind his back while he worked, while he took care of the house, while he believed everything was fine. Helena arrived half an hour later. He was still there, sitting, motionless, the phone on the table between them like a bomb about to explode. She saw it, and knew. There was no way to hide, no way to lie. The silence was the first confession. Then came the words. Daniel, I can explain. But he didn't want explanations. He wanted this not to be true. He wanted to wake up. He wanted the last 23 years not to be a lie. But they were, at least the last 2. Helena cried, said she hadn't planned it, that it happened, that she regretted it. But she also said something that cut deeper than everything. I don't know if I still love you. Those words echoed in the empty room. Daniel didn't yell, didn't break anything. He just looked at the woman he loved and saw a stranger, someone he didn't know, someone capable of destroying everything they'd built with their own hands. Rodrigo. He couldn't get the name out of his head. Rodrigo, who had dinner with them every Sunday, who played ball with Lucas, who helped paint Sophia's room. Rodrigo, who held his hand in difficult moments and said, I'm here, brother. Rodrigo, who looked him in the eyes and lied, who kissed his wife while he fixed furniture to support the family. Helena's betrayal hurt, but Rodrigo's was a different kind of pain. It was the breaking of something he thought unbreakable. Brotherhood, trust, loyalty. The following days were a blur. Daniel left the house, not because Helena asked, but because he couldn't stand being there. Every corner of that house was a memory. Every photo on the wall was a framed lie. He rented a small room near the workshop. Barely ate, barely slept. Worked until his hands bled, because it was the only thing that kept him from thinking. But at night, in the silence, everything returned. The images, the questions, the hatred growing like weeds in fertile soil. And then Lucas called. Dad, we need to talk. There was something in his son's voice that made Daniel freeze. Something he already knew but didn't want to hear. Because the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And the worst was yet to come. Lucas was waiting at a cafe near the university. Daniel arrived 15 minutes late, hands still dirty with sawdust, eyes sunken from someone who hadn't slept in days. His son stood up when he saw him, but the embrace was brief, uncomfortable. There was a distance there that had never existed before. Daniel sat down and waited for Lucas to say what he already suspected but hoped he was wrong about. "Dad, Sophia left home." The words fell like stones. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Sophia was only 17. She went to live with Mom and with Rodrigo. The name came out like spit. Lucas couldn't hide his disgust. They rented an apartment together, the three of them. Daniel closed his eyes, breathed deeply, tried to process what that meant. His daughter, his little girl, living under the same roof as the man who destroyed his family. "And you?" Daniel managed to ask, his voice hoarse. Lucas looked away. I don't know, Dad. Mom wants me to come too. Says it's better for everyone. That we need to move forward. Move forward. As if 23 years could be erased with an administrative decision. As if love and betrayal were issues resolvable through logistics. Daniel looked at his son and saw confusion. Saw a 19-year-old boy being forced to choose between his parents. Between right and wrong. Between the past and an uncertain future. "You don't have to choose anything," Daniel said, each word weighing tons. "I'm your father. Nothing changes that. You do what feels right." But deep down, he knew he was losing. That Helena had more to offer. A bigger house, apparent stability. Rodrigo had money, a successful advertising firm. Daniel had a rented room and calloused hands. The math was cruel but simple. The conversation ended without conclusion. Lucas promised to think about it. Promised to call. But when Daniel returned to the empty room that night, he knew his family had shattered in a way that couldn't be fixed. Not in the traditional way. Not in the way he understood. Helena didn't just betray him. She rebuilt a new life without him. And worse, she was taking the children along. The following days were silent hell. Daniel kept working, but his customers started complaining. Wrong measurements, careless finishes, missed deadlines. He who had always been meticulous, perfectionist, now couldn't concentrate for more than 10 minutes at a time. His mind was always somewhere else. Imagining Helena and Rodrigo together. Imagining Sophia calling that man to dinner. Imagining Lucas laughing at jokes he didn't hear. He was being erased, replaced, forgotten. One night, he drank. Daniel was never a drinker, but that night he bought a bottle of cheap whiskey and drank until the world became blurry, until the pains felt distant. But when he woke up on the floor, the sun burning his eyes and his head exploding, the pain was still there, intact, waiting. Because pain doesn't dissolve in alcohol, it just hides temporarily and returns with interest. That's when the hatred began to take shape. It was no longer just hurt, no longer just sadness. It was pure visceral rage, the feeling of being disintegrated from the inside. Daniel began to fantasize. Fantasize about confronting Rodrigo, about making him pay for what he did, for the stolen years, for the broken trust, for the nights he slept in his house, ate at his table, and then went into his wife's arms. The hatred grew like a tumor, fed on every memory, every humiliation, every loss. And then came the news that changed everything. Helena called. Her voice was calm, almost clinical. "Daniel, we need to talk about the divorce. My lawyer will be in touch." Divorce, the final word, the point of no return. And before he could respond, she added, "And about the house. Rodrigo wants to buy out your share. He's willing to pay a fair price." A fair price. As if there were a fair price for 23 years of life. As if money could buy the right to erase his existence. Daniel hung up, and for the first time since everything began, he cried. Cried like he hadn't cried since childhood. Cried until he had no more tears. Until his chest felt empty and his ribs hurt. Because he finally understood. Understood there was no going back. That his family was over. That he was alone. And that hatred, no matter how great, wouldn't change anything. But still, he fed it. Because hatred was the only thing keeping him standing. The only thing filling the void Helena and Rodrigo left behind. The following months brought a strange routine. Daniel signed papers, attended hearings, divided assets like someone carving up a carcass. The house went to Helena. He got half the money from the sale and some furniture nobody wanted anymore. The things he'd built with his own hands. Now dusty in storage. Symbols of a life that no longer existed. But then something unexpected happened. Sophia called. "Dad, can you pick me up?" Her voice was shaky. Daniel dropped everything and went. Found his daughter sitting on a park bench, eyes red, face marked by recent tears. She didn't explain much, just said she'd fought with her mother, that she couldn't stand living in that house anymore, that she missed him. And for the first time in months, Daniel felt something besides pain. He felt hope. Sophia began visiting him regularly. Yatiar. Saturdays they'd have lunch together at a simple restaurant near the workshop. She'd talk about school, about friends, about the dreams she had. And Daniel listened, just listened, drank in every word like someone dying of thirst. Because those moments were all he had left. They were proof he still mattered, that he was still a father, that he still had a place in the world. And then Lucas came back too. Not to live, but to talk. To play cards on Thursday nights. To ask for advice about college, about his new girlfriend, about life. And Daniel felt his chest fill with something he'd forgotten. Joy. Maybe not everything was lost. Maybe there was still a chance. Not to win Helena back, that was impossible and he knew it. But to win back his children. To rebuild at least this part of the family. He started taking better care of himself. Ate properly again. Fixed up the rented room. Bought new clothes. Even considered going out with a coworker who showed interest. The pain was still there, of course, the hatred too. But now there was something more. There was purpose, there was a future. He didn't need Helena to be complete. Didn't need Rodrigo apologizing. He had his children, and that was enough. Or at least, that's what he tried to believe. But life has a cruel way of reminding us that not all hope is real, and that sometimes what seems like healing is just a pause before the next fall. Daniel discovered this on a November afternoon, when Lucas called with news. "Dad, I need to tell you something. Mom's pregnant." The world stopped. "Pregnant?" Daniel repeated, unable to process. "With Rodrigo's baby. They're going to have a child." The phone almost slipped from his hand. He hung up, sat down, tried to breathe. Helena, pregnant. With Rodrigo's baby, a child, a new family being built on the rubble of the old one. And suddenly everything made sense. Sophia coming back. Lucas getting closer. It wasn't because they missed him. It was because they were preparing. Preparing for the arrival of a new sibling. For the officialization of a new reality. And Daniel was just the ghost of the past. The man who needed to be appeased before the new life began. He laughed alone in that empty room. A bitter laugh without joy. Because he had believed, had allowed himself to dream, had opened his chest again, knowing he was vulnerable. And now, once more, life stuck the knife in and twisted. The hope he'd felt in recent months was false. An illusion. A trick of the mind to make the pain bearable. But the truth was simple and brutal. He had been replaced, in every sense. And there was no going back. Daniel stopped answering calls, stopped going to Saturdays with Sophia, stopped responding to Lucas, stopped working, stopped eating, simply stopped. Because there was no more reason to continue, no more reason to wake up, to breathe, to exist. He was a ghost inhabiting a body that insisted on functioning against his will. The workshop sent a warning, then another, then fired him. Daniel didn't even care. The divorce money was running out. The rent fell behind. The landlord knocked on the door with threats and deadlines. Daniel heard him through the closed door and didn't respond. None of it mattered. Nothing had weight anymore. He was sinking. And the scariest part was that he didn't want to be saved. Nights were the worst. He'd lie on the thin mattress and feel his body ache. Not from illness, from absence. From loneliness so deep it became physical. He'd close his eyes and see Helena pregnant. See Rodrigo touching her belly. See his children smiling at a baby who wasn't their sibling, but rather the symbol that he had been erased, replaced, discarded like old furniture that no longer serves a purpose. He thought about dying. Not abstractly, concretely, planned. Thought about how it would be. Quick, painless, final. Thought about the relief of not feeling anything anymore, of not carrying that crushing weight in his chest anymore. Thought about ending it all before the world finished destroying him, because at least that way the choice would be his. The control would be his. The last word would be his. One night he wrote letters, one for Lucas, one for Sophia, apologizing for not being strong enough, for not being able to continue, for giving up. The words came out crooked, stained with tears. He folded the papers, placed them on the table, and looked at the rope he'd bought the week before. It was there, waiting, calling, promising peace. But then the phone rang. Daniel looked at the lit screen in the dark. Sophia. He almost didn't answer, almost let it ring until it went to voicemail. But something, maybe instinct, maybe cowardice, maybe one last thread of hope, made his hand move. Dad? Her voice was broken. Dad, are you there? He couldn't respond. Just held the phone against his ear and cried silently. Dad, I know you're listening to me. Please, don't do it. How did she know? How could she know? But she knew. Mothers have intuition. Daughters, too. Sophia was crying on the other end of the line. I need you. Lucas needs you. We messed up. We didn't understand, but you can't give up. Please, Dad, please. And Daniel, with the rope still beside him, with the letters ready, with death so close he could smell it, did the only thing he could still do. He spoke. Okay, sweetheart. I'm here. But he lied. Because he wasn't there. Not really. He was at the bottom of a pit so dark he couldn't even see the light. And even though Sophia had stopped him that night, he knew the pit would still be there, waiting. Because the bottom hadn't arrived yet. There was still one more fall. And it would come from where he least expected. There are moments in life when silence speaks louder than any words. Daniel spent weeks in that silence. Not the empty silence from before, but a different silence. Loaded. Dense. As if the universe was waiting for him to understand something. Something important. Something that had always been there, but he'd never been able to see through the fog of pain. He started walking. Every morning before sunrise, he'd leave his room and walk through the empty city streets. No destination, no purpose. Just walked. And while his feet touched the cold asphalt, his mind began to detach, to release the moorings, to question things that before seemed absolute. Like guilt, like forgiveness, like the meaning of carrying a hatred so heavy it was killing what remained of him. One morning he stopped in front of an old church. He wasn't religious. Never was. But something about that place attracted him. Maybe the architecture. Maybe the silence. Maybe the implicit promise that there, within those ancient walls, answers were possible. He entered, sat on a wooden bench worn by time, and looked at the empty altar. And for the first time in months, he didn't think about Helena. Didn't think about Rodrigo. Didn't think about the betrayal. He thought about himself, about who he was, about who he'd become, about who he wanted to be. There was a priest there, an old man, completely white hair, tired but kind eyes. He sat down beside Daniel without asking permission. They stayed there for minutes that felt like hours, until the priest spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "The weight you carry isn't yours." Daniel turned to him. "What do you know about what I carry?" The priest smiled, a sad smile from someone who'd already seen much pain. "I know you're dying, not in body, in soul, and I know you think you have the right to die that way, but you don't." Daniel wanted to get up, wanted to leave, but couldn't, because those words touched something deep, something he'd buried under layers of anger and self-pity. "They destroyed me," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "They took everything from me." The priest nodded. "Yes, they did. And it hurts. And it's unfair. And you have every right to feel what you feel. But tell me something. How much longer will you let them keep taking? How much more will you feed this hatred that keeps them alive inside you, every day, every night?" The words echoed in the church's silence. Daniel didn't respond, because he had no answer. Because for the first time he realized the cruel truth. The hatred he felt wasn't hurting Helena, wasn't hurting Rodrigo, was hurting only him, was being the poison he drank hoping others would die. And while he consumed himself, they went on with their lives. Happy, pregnant, building futures. While he withered in a rented room, feeding a fire that only burned himself. The priest stood up, placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. Doesn't mean what they did was right. It just means you're choosing not to let it keep killing you. It means you're choosing to live." And then he left. Left Daniel alone with those words. Alone with the hardest choice he'd ever had to make. Daniel stayed there, for hours, looking at the ancient walls, at the candles burning silently, at the light coming through the colored stained glass. And something inside him began to change. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but like a seed that cracks hard earth and begins to sprout, slowly, almost imperceptible, but real. He began to understand there were two paths before him. One was to keep carrying that weight until it destroyed him completely. The other was to release it, not because they deserved forgiveness, but because he deserved peace. And for the first time since everything began, Daniel considered the second option, not as weakness, not as defeat, but as survival, as the last and most courageous choice he could make, the choice to free himself, not to let betrayal have the last word about his life, not to give Helena and Rodrigo the power to define who he was, because he was more than the sum of his pains, was more than a betrayed man, was a father, was a carpenter, was someone who still had stories to live. And if he wanted to live them, he needed to release the past, needed to forgive, not for them, but for himself. Daniel didn't wake up that day knowing what he'd do, didn't have a divine revelation, didn't hear voices, didn't see signs in the sky. He just woke up with a strange certainty, almost physical, that this was the day he needed to do the hardest thing of his life, not out of obligation, not from pressure, but because if he didn't do it, he'd die. Maybe not physically, but he'd die inside, and he didn't want to die anymore. He grabbed paper and pen, sat at the table, and began to write. Not a farewell letter like the ones he'd written before, but a letter of liberation, for Helena, for Rodrigo, for himself. The words came slowly, each one weighing like lead. "I forgive you." 12 letters, 3 words, a universe of meaning. He stopped, reread, felt something break inside his chest. Not a new pain, but the old pain finally finding an exit. He kept writing, not because he had much to say, but because he needed to get it all out. Forgiving didn't mean forgetting, he wrote. Didn't mean what they did was right. Didn't mean he hadn't suffered. It just meant he was choosing to let go. Was choosing not to let it keep poisoning every day he had left. was choosing to live even though living hurt, because living always hurts, but it's better than dying while still breathing. When he finished, he folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and did something he hadn't done in months. Got dressed, shaved, looked at himself in the mirror. The man looking back was unrecognizable, thinner, older, more marked. But there was something new in his eyes, something that wasn't there before. Maybe it was determination. Maybe it was acceptance. Maybe it was just deep exhaustion from carrying so much weight. But it was there. And it was enough. He went to the house that was his, that still held his memories in every wall, every corner, every brick. Helena answered the door. The shock on her face was visible. Daniel? She placed her hand over her belly, now large, evident. Rodrigo's child growing there where his children had grown. Daniel felt the familiar stab, but didn't let it knock him down. I came to bring this, he said, extending the envelope. You can read it now if you want. Helena took the envelope with trembling hands, opened it, read, and when she finished, there were tears in her eyes. Daniel, He raised his hand. You don't need to say anything. This isn't about you. It's about me. About freeing myself. About not letting what happened define the rest of my life. She nodded, unable to speak. And then, unexpectedly, she said, I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. I don't expect you to believe it, but it's true. Daniel looked at her, at the woman he'd loved for more than half his life, and for the first time, he felt no hatred, felt no love either, just felt peace. A strange peace, melancholic, but real. I believe you, he said, and I hope you're happy, truly. He didn't know if he completely believed those words, but he said them anyway, because he needed to say them, needed to hear them coming from his mouth, needed to start believing them. Rodrigo appeared behind Helena. His eyes met Daniel's. There was fear there, guilt, shame. Rodrigo opened his mouth to speak, but Daniel interrupted him. I wrote for you too. He took another envelope from his pocket. But I'll say it in person, I forgive you. Not because you asked, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve not to carry this anymore. You destroyed our friendship. You betrayed my trust, and I'll never forget. But I also won't let it keep destroying me. So I forgive. And now, I'm leaving. And you're free. And I am too. He turned to leave, but then he heard running footsteps. Sophia. She appeared at the door, face wet with tears. Dad. She threw herself into his arms, and Daniel held her with all the strength he still had. I thought you'd never come back, she cried against his chest. I thought I'd lost you. Daniel kissed the top of her head. You'll never lose me, never. I'm your father, always will be, no matter what happens. Lucas also appeared, more reserved but with red eyes. Dad, Daniel pulled him into the embrace too. The three stayed there, at the door of that house that was no longer his, embraced like they hadn't been in months. And Daniel felt something he was certain he'd never feel again. Joy. Pure. Simple. Unmixed. Joy at being alive. At being there. At having his children in his arms. At having chosen the hardest path, but the only one that led to light. When they separated, Daniel looked at the three, at Helena, at Rodrigo, at the house. Take care of each other, he said. And then finally, he left. Walked down the street he'd walked so many times. But now it was different. Lighter. As if he'd left an invisible burden behind. The hatred was gone. The anger had dissolved. What remained was just a soft sadness. Acceptable. Human. The sadness of a chapter that ended, but also the hope that new chapters could still be written. Daniel no longer had a family in the traditional sense, no longer had a house, no longer had certainties. But he had something worth more than all that. He had peace. And for the first time in over a year, he could breathe deeply without his chest tightening, could look at the sky without tears blurring his vision, could imagine a future that wasn't just pain and survival, but maybe, just maybe, something close to happiness. Daniel lived 3 more years after that day, 3 years that, in many ways, were the truest of his life. Not because they were the happiest, they weren't, but because they were the most honest. He didn't pretend the pain had completely disappeared, didn't pretend he woke up every day at peace, but he learned to live with the scars, learned that healing isn't the absence of pain, but the ability to live despite it. He went back to work, not at the same workshop, but at a small carpentry shop that agreed to give a chance to a man in his early 50s with trembling hands and a heavy past. He made simple furniture, chairs, tables, shelves, and each piece he created was a form of meditation. Each cut of the saw, each sanding of the wood, was a silent prayer, a thanksgiving for being alive, for having chosen to stay, for having found a path through the darkness. Sophia and Lucas became part of his life again, not in the old way, that would never return, but in a new way, more honest, more conscious. They had lunch together on Sundays, talked about important things and trivial things, and Daniel learned not to ask about Helena, not to mention Rodrigo, not to touch wounds that were still sensitive. He learned that love doesn't need to be perfect to be real, that family doesn't need to be complete to matter. He met someone else, Clara, a widowed woman who frequented the same bakery he did. They started with brief conversations about the weather, about bread, about things without importance. But gradually, the conversations got longer, deeper. And one day, having coffee on a cold morning, she asked, "Why do you always look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders?" And Daniel, for the first time, told her everything. Everything. Without omitting. Without embellishing. And when he finished, he expected to see pity in her eyes. But he saw only understanding. Clara didn't try to fix him, didn't offer easy solutions, just stayed there, present, while he processed years of pain in stumbling words. And that simple presence was enough. They didn't get married, didn't live together, but they built something delicate and beautiful, a companionship, a refuge, a reminder that even broken hearts can still beat, can still love, can still find moments of light in persistent darkness. But then, like all stories, his also needed to end. The diagnosis came on an ordinary afternoon: cancer, advanced, too late for aggressive treatment. 6 months, maybe a year, the doctor said with the neutral voice of someone who gives bad news every day. Daniel left the office and walked to the park, sat on a bench, looked at the trees, at children playing, at life happening around him, and felt something unexpected: gratitude. Because he could have died 3 years ago, in that dark room, with a rope in his hands and nothing resolved. But he didn't die. He lived long enough to make peace with himself. And that, he realized, was everything. He told his children, told Clara, told the few people who mattered, and decided he didn't want to spend his last months in hospitals, fighting the inevitable. He wanted to spend them at home, in peace, doing what he loved, creating his last pieces of wood, writing his last words, because Daniel had something important to say, something he'd learned firsthand, something that cost everything but was, worth every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of searing pain. He grabbed paper and pen, the same tools he'd used to write letters of forgiveness, and began writing again. But this time, not for Helena, not for Rodrigo, for whoever needed to hear it, for whoever was carrying a similar weight, for whoever thought forgiving was impossible. If you're reading this, he wrote, it's because someone also hurt you deeply. Maybe it was a betrayal. Maybe an injustice. Maybe something that should never have happened. And you're wondering if it's possible to move forward, if it's possible to forgive, if it's possible to find peace after your world collapsed. I don't have all the answers, but I have one. Yes, it's possible. It's not easy. It's not quick. And it doesn't happen because you decided on an enlightened day that you're going to forgive, and that's it. It happens gradually, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one breath at a time. Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, doesn't mean saying what they did to you was right, doesn't mean going back, doesn't mean being weak. It just means you're deciding not to let it keep destroying you, that you're choosing to live, even though living hurts, that you're freeing yourself from the weight of carrying hatred that only hurts you. I lost my family, lost my house, lost years of my life to anger and resentment, and when I finally forgave, I didn't recover anything I lost, but I gained something much more valuable. I got myself back. I gained the ability to breathe without my chest burning, to sleep without nightmares, to look at the future without seeing only darkness. So if you're suffering now, if you're thinking about giving up, if you think forgiveness is impossible, I tell you it's not. It's difficult, it's painful, it's the longest and most tortuous path, but it's the only path that leads to peace. And you deserve peace, even if you don't feel it, even if you don't believe it. You deserve it. Daniel finished writing, reread the words, felt tears running down his face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of completion, of having managed to translate into words what took years to understand. He folded the paper, gave it to Sophia. When I'm gone, you decide what to do with this. But I'd like other people to read it, to know it's possible, that forgiving isn't about them, it's about us. The last days were serene. Daniel was surrounded by those he loved. Sophia and Lucas stayed with him. Clara held his hand. He felt no pain. The medication took care of that. Just felt a deep calm, an acceptance, a gratitude for having lived, for having suffered, for having overcome, for having found in the end what he'd been searching for from the beginning. Peace. On the last night, with breathing becoming more difficult, he called his children, held their hands, and said the last words he wanted them to hear. I love you, always loved you, always will love you, and I'm at peace. Don't hold anger toward anyone, not toward your mother, not toward Rodrigo, not toward life, because anger will only hurt you, and you deserve to be happy, deserve to live without carrying what I carried. So promise me, promise you'll choose peace, always. They promised, crying, holding him, and Daniel closed his eyes, and for the last time felt something he'd forgotten, completeness. He had completed his journey, had faced his demons, had chosen the hardest path, and had reached the end not in defeat, but in victory. Not in bitterness, but in peace. Not in despair, but in serenity. And his last words, written on that paper Sophia would share with the world, continued echoing long after his heart stopped beating. Because truth is like that. It doesn't die with those who speak it. It continues, passes forward, touches other hearts, other lives, other people who need to hear that it's possible to survive the worst, that it's possible to forgive the unforgivable, that it's possible to find light even after the deepest darkness. Daniel Ferreira forgave those who destroyed his family and found peace, not because he was a saint, not because he was special, but because he was human, and because he understood, late but not too late, that forgiving isn't a gift you give to those who hurt you. It's a gift you give yourself. It's the key that opens the prison where you locked yourself. It's the first step toward freedom, and we all deserve to be free. May his last words remind us. Peace doesn't come when everything is perfect. It comes when you choose acceptance instead of resistance. It comes when you release what you can't change. It comes when you decide you deserve to live, not just survive. And that choice, as difficult as it may be, is always available, always within your reach, always waiting for you to be brave enough to make it.